Welcome to Friday night's video in our second master series. I do believe this is the first video in our second master series, the 30th video in our basic processors, and the 17th video in dealing with reverb and convolution. So the next thing we wanted to talk about, I really hope it sunk home in that first video about parameters, about how this wet and dry parameter, after all the work you've done, is going to be the most important thing for you to master, and the amounts that you use to make it sound good, so you don't have too little or too much reverb, and too much or too little reverb in the wrong areas and things like that, and really work on mastering that, which really comes to really honing your critical listening to good music, good tracks, and honing your abilities on your own stuff of, emulating that sound, not so much trying to figure out exactly what they did, but applying the convolution reverb concepts we talked about in ways that hopefully that will come out sound better than a lot of tracks that you like. Does that make sense? But it's really the most important parameter you come across. When we come into the next parameters we're going to talk about, these parameters, the most important next parameters, are parameters that re-sculpt or reshape the actual impulse response, or the convolution sound, convolution sound, the sound that comes out after going through convolution. So anyway, sorry about that. But we look at, like, the next one would be our EQ, our onboard EQ. Now this EQ, if we go through and we remember how much time we spent equalizing our frequency responses, or in our impulse responses, because of how important the frequency response is, and normally what they listen to most, it's one of the next most important parameters, because there's a couple of different things there. First of all, we've talked about making up a little library, having your initial frequency response like a small hall, and then making up a flat frequency response version of that, and a really good EQ'd version of that that sounds like a really nice room, and making smaller versions of them, like we talked about C50 clearing guys. Now, if you have this small hall that just sounds nice, it sounds like a nice room, but it's just like going to a really nice studio. If I go into a really nice studio in LA and I take a little Tracy with me, and it's like, Tracy sounds awesome in this room, and it's like, yeah, dude, all right. But then I bring Bob, and Bob does not sound as good in that room. It just doesn't. I've tried a few different microphones, and it's like, that room just doesn't do him justice with the harmonic content in his voice, the way he sings, possibly the saturation, noise, and distortion, and things like that. It doesn't work as well for him. So with him, the room needs to have a little bit more higher end, or it needs a little bit more bass end, or it needs a little more mid-range, low mid-range, high mid-range, or something like that, or some certain frequency area. So there's a couple different things. You can go resculpt the impulse response to better fit the individual, which we talked about doing that. Or you can use your built-in equalizer on your convolution reverb. So you've already got this great impulse response of this small hall, right? And it just sounds great. We did all the work we talked about. It sounds awesome. But for this one individual, that track, let's say that's individual. We've done all the EQ work on it, all the processing. We're up to doing reverberation spatialization on that track, and it sounds great, dude. Does that make sense? But we're getting ready to add reverb to it to put it in its place, bodybuilding and reverberation. And the room would be better with Bob if it had a little more high end. So I've got a shell filter in the high upper end, a shell filter in the lower end, and a couple band EQs. So that it's not, I don't have an adjustable Q on it, but hopefully it should do a pretty good job, because it shouldn't be that minute detailed. But you can go back and resculpt those individual responses if you want to do even a better job. But sometimes this will fly with this. Sometimes your convolution reverb may have more options, like my Pro EQ or something, or sometimes less. So you might want to think about re-equalizing a little bit after you run it through the convolution reverb if you can't deal with the problem here, or deal with it on the individual track and redo a little bit of equalizing a little bit different, which probably ain't going to work, but you could re-equalize the impulse response. But a lot of times, Bob's voice just needs a more low end. So I figure out about where I want the shelf EQ, and I'm going to boost the low end up just a little bit. Does that make sense? And then it sounds great. It's just like you're sculpting the frequency response of this impulse response. I wouldn't say that this is built to completely sculpt the frequency response of the impulse response in the way that we've talked about so far in this short segment on impulse responses and convolution reverb. But it can do enough to make it fly. To where a lot of times it'll be the room has a little more bass end. It's a little more richer and thicker. So you can bring a shelf EP up EQ and make it the impulse response that's in the convolution reverb just a little lower end to give it a little more richness and lower end. Or it might need a little more upper end or a little less upper end. It's like, well, no, Bob's voice, if I bring this shelf EQ down to about, maybe 5K or something, and I boost it up there, yeah, now it sounds great, because it was just a little too rich, and low-endy kind of that room when I got done, because it's a nice sounding room. But for him, it could use a little bit more upper end, content, which basically is getting convolved onto, all the early and late reflections coming back, that's being convolved onto the sound of himself. Just like a room that you can go into the room, and that beautiful room, you can re-equalize the room just a little bit. Does that make sense? Maybe not drastically like going back and re-sculpting the impulse response, but more than likely that, as you become a master audio engineer, like if I had like Whitney Houston in my studio and they were paying me bazillions of dollars, that I would probably spend a lot of time. Most people can't afford to have you spend that much time, there's a lot of things I talk about in my master series, and we're going to talk about in this second master series, that some people you just can't spend that much time on and expect they're going to pay you for it. But you can, but it's coming out of your pocket, right? So sometimes you can and can't. If you're getting paid for it, you can spend the next 2 months sculpting boutique responses for Whitney Houston until her voice is just beautiful in the most perfect room ever made for her voice. Does that make sense? So, and it's like, so you've got, these options that you can add a little bit here or there. Or you've got their voice is a little bit honky and whiny. So somewhere around 500 hertz, 600 hertz or something, you might want to go find that, frequency and go, oh yeah, right around there, bro. Let's just attenuate that a little bit on the frequency response, because, it sounds great on the impulse response, but he don't really need that added input on there, and it's actually being detrimental, because you're looking for, because the room's going to amplify that, and the convolution reverb is going to multiply that. Does that make sense? So it can be an issue a little bit. So this next biggest thing, since we talked about, some of the biggest impact a room has on an individual, they hear the reflections coming back and, the space and stuff. But a lot of times it's the frequency response that really gets them and hooks them. It's like, no, I really like this room. It's got this rich, full, low end, or this a little brassier high end and opener sound. And yeah, it's like got this, this shimmery sound, on my voice. And yeah, and they just love it. Yeah, let's record. It's like, you know what I'm saying? And people will go on great lengths traveling around the world if they got money to find a perfect room to sing it. So this concept is huge in you, developing yourself as that next level master audio engineer, so you can there's thousands and thousands of those types of rooms around the world, and you can sculpt a pretty basic impulse response to emulate pretty closely those rooms easily. Well, we're not going to say easily, because we know how long this series has been so far. And also, it's a critical listening thing, that you can catch that and know that it needs a little more low end or a little bit less low end in the frequency response or the impulse response, or a little more high end or a little less high end, or, if some certain frequency range needs to be attenuated or boosted a little bit. And a lot of times you don't have a lot of options here. but the majority of the time that it may be like I talked about the honk, there's some frequency in there that you need to attenuate a little bit, or maybe you want to boost it a little bit. But a lot of times it's your shelf filters and your high and low end that you take this beautiful response of this nice room like this small hall, and you just want to give it a little more rich lower end, or a little bit more upper shimmer, in the upper end, that's kind of helps out, or attenuate it or boost it. You can go either way with it, and depending, on how much you have to push it up or down, which way you want to address that issue. But it's your next biggest parameters on your convolution reverb, so that after you've done all this work and you have this wonderful impulse response, that it sometimes doesn't take much, to boost the low end a little bit, to get a little bit more low end richer sound that really works well with this individual you're working with. Or you want to give them a little more shimmer, up in the upper end, and boosting that up a little bit there. Those are just a couple really simple examples of, the more you understand the convolution reverb, the more you're going to want to study impulse frequency response and acoustics, as far as acoustics meaning, rooms and things like that, and spatialization, different rooms from all over the world that have been sculpted by acousticians, that is just, it's unbelievable, the mathematics and what they look into, and really phenomenal ones. It's unbelievable what they do. And seeing that we're in a two-dimensional environment, we really have a problem replicating that, but we can still do a lot. So these parameters here can really save you when you don't have the time or not able to re-sculpt the impulse response, or you don't want to for this application, or you might not need to. Even if I had a big name person in there, I was like, no, I'm going to try it here, and if not, then I'm going to go back and re-sculpt it. Depends on the situation. You really have to, that's an opinion thing. Does that make sense? You always want to do the best job you can, but there's been some times where it's like I can't spend the next 6 months getting this guy's 3 songs together. And he's paying me $20 a pop. It's like, isn't that not flying, right? So, there's lots of defining factors there, right? So, but this is a salvation for you to really help you, because it's one of the most important aspects of our impulse response, is the frequency response of our impulse response. And here you can do a little bit of work to take that beautifully sound sculpted impulse response. It sounds like it was this beautiful room, and just add a little bit, or attenuate a little bit in certain areas on that impulse response, to just tweak it a little bit and fine tune it a little bit to where it's better suited to the individual that you're trying to convolve this space onto. Does that make sense? And it can work the same when you're doing with your bodybuilding also. So when you're doing your bodybuilding, you want to take that into consideration also, because you've got that beautiful sound sculpted, response for bodybuilding, and we talked about that, and just a little slight tweaking on it, or a little bit of adjustment on it might do the trick. It might not. You might have to go re-sculpt it, start out with a flat frequency response on that impulse response, and re-sculpt it for that individual, but you might not have to. Or depending on the application, if you have the time to spend on it, or if there's some applications to where it's like, no, it's not going to be heard that well. But if I can just boost the bass end up a little bit, the room sounds a little bit richer, darker, and yeah, that's going to be great in the back of the mix. I don't have to go back and re-sculpt a whole dang impulse response to get that effect. It sounds great. That's, yeah, all right, yeah, good to go. Hoo-ha, yeah. Does that make sense? So, it's a lifesaver. It really is. And the more I experiment with that and check it out, that you'll see that how much time it can save you, and the value of it. So I just wanted to address that next, because that's probably the next biggest parameter that we have to deal with when we're working on our impulse responses in our convolution reverb. So peace, hope, love. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you in the next one.